London, Getty, London, September 21st. I am coming to London, and Left It Wall is going to be screening at the Bill Murray at 3 p.m. That's September 21st, the Bill Murray, 3 p.m. It will be the only UK screening of Left It Wall. Can't wait to see you there. Grab your tickets now at romplicone.com. London, can't wait to see you again. It's been too long. romplicone.com for tickets. See you September 21st. Episode 52, Josh Spector. Josh Spector is a marketing expert who helps businesses get more clients from their content. He runs the For the Interested newsletter, and he has a podcast called I Want to Know. Josh's blogs and advice changed my life. Josh used to run a blog called Connected Comedy, where he gave advice specifically for comedians. At the time, I was doing stand-up in Pittsburgh, going to graduate school by day, and I was starting to get more road work on the weekends. I was also writing a fair amount of topical news-centric material that didn't always translate to the stand-up stage. Josh put out an article about making sure you were putting your material in the best format for it to succeed. So, I started doing a mini-cast, where I did 1-minute segments featuring the news-centric stuff. That segment got picked up by a show called The David Pakman Show. Later, via that segment and a show I produced for Lee Camp, I became affiliated with the Young Turks Network, and through the Young Turks Network, I met Jimmy Dore. I worked on The Jimmy Dore Show for some years. It was my first major gig in LA and one that sent me on a new trajectory. While I quit the show a while ago, and, much like those other entities mentioned, it's a different show now than it was, it's a significant part of my path. And when I faced another crossroads, this time more recently, I turned to Josh's work again. In this case, the topic was when it was time to fold a project and evolve. The mental exercise was, imagine if you went outside and got hit by a bus or something tragic happened. Think about the last piece of content you created and shared with the world. Would you be satisfied with that being your final swan song? With my old podcast, Get Your News On with Ron, the answer to that question was no. With this show, the answer was, and still is, yes. So it makes sense that on our 52nd episode, marking an official year of shows, Josh is my guest. Please welcome to the show, Josh Spector. Josh Spector, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's nice to. I feel like this has been a long time coming, so I'm glad we finally got it scheduled.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start basic. In your own words, describe what it is you do.
Oh, if only that were basic.
Sure.
No, I help experts and small business owners to grow their audience, and primarily doing that using content, broadly speaking. So newsletters, social media, that kind of stuff, mostly written content. And my business basically has kind of two pieces to it. So one piece is I have a newsletter called For the Interested, which people can check out at fortheinterested.com/subscribe. And through that, it's a free newsletter. I share all types of tips and advice and strategies to help you use content to grow your business. And then I also have a Skill Sessions membership, which is basically a series of sort of mini courses on specific things, right? So how to grow your newsletter, how to get clients, how to define your niche, those kinds of things. And then I also do a little consulting with companies and people as well. Again, all rooted in this idea of so many people are creating quote unquote content. You know, in a lot of ways, every individual, every company is now a media company to a certain extent. But one of the things that I found is that so much of that content is not actually generating any results. And they're putting all this time and effort into it, and then they're getting really frustrated because they're not getting any business out of it, or clients, or whatever it is, promoting their cause, whatever they want to do. And typically I find that's because they're not really being as strategic as they could be with that content. So I help them figure out how to get more out of the time and effort that they're putting into it, basically.
So I've been following you for a long time, which we're going to dive into those specifics in a little bit here. But how did you arrive where you're at now? Like, give a little bit of a backstory, because I feel like as long as I've been following you, your origin stories, there's a little bit out there, but I'm kind of intrigued. Like, what was your process getting to where you're at? Because you help so many other people do it, but you did it too.
It's interesting. Like, I've had, in some ways, several careers that are sort of completely different, but in other ways, there's a clear through line in retrospect that connects them all. So I'll try to give the sort of quick crash course. Graduated from the University of Maryland, studied journalism, thought I wanted to be a journalist, moved to Los Angeles, got a job working for an entertainment PR agency, became basically a writer for that PR agency. So I was writing marketing materials, press kits, all that kind of stuff. From there, wound up getting a job with one of their clients, this was like very early web, right? So this is like 1999-ish, whatever, a company that was building the first like celebrity websites. Right. So very early on, like back then, people were even, celebrities were even like, I need a website. What do I need a website for? So really, really weird. And so I was doing that. And then from there, I wound up getting sort of back into journalism, worked at the Hollywood Reporter, covered the film industry, worked at a site called inside.com, which was sort of a competitor to the trades that was online. To give you an idea of sort of how different the internet world was then, which this seems insane now, but back then, one of the things I did was, people didn't even really know what a blog was, but basically I wrote a daily blog summarizing like the news of the day in the film industry. But none of so it'd be like, oh, Variety reported this, Hollywood Reporter reported this, blah, blah, blah. But none of those sites updated their websites during the day because they were all about print. So my job was to wait until midnight. I'd work in the middle of the day, and then I'd work another shift at like midnight to like 2 a.m, waiting for Variety to update their website so that I could then write the summary for the next morning of like, here's the news of the day. Because again, back then they weren't updating their websites during the day, which now seems insane. But back then seemed normal. So I did that. And then from there, I wound up going to work for the Hollywood Reporter. From there, I wound up going to work at New Line Cinema in their marketing department. So as you can see, sort of all of these jobs were combination of like early internet, marketing, journalism, entertainment industry. Like in retrospect, I look at it and it's all sort of content strategy, even though back then that wasn't even really a thing. And then after working at New Line Cinema, I wound up going to a startup comedy website called comedy.com, and I ran content and marketing for them, and then went out on my own to create what was called, which I think is how we first met. I had a site called Connected Comedy.
Oh yeah, we're going to get to that.
Yeah. Which was basically, I was working as sort of a marketing consultant, in some ways very similar to what I'm doing now, but specifically focused on comedians and how they can use social media, which again, at the time was relatively new and seems insane now. But back then, lots of comedians actually had to be convinced that social media mattered. They were still the only ones that thought it mattered at all, had built big MySpace followings that then disappeared overnight. So they didn't like it anymore. And other people were like, why do I have to do this? I don't get it. So I did that. And then my former boss, when I had been at New Line Cinema, reached out to me, and she got hired to be the chief marketing officer at the Oscars and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So I was not really looking for a job, and I was enjoying working for myself, but it was like too good an opportunity to turn down. So that was around like 2011. And I basically went and ran digital media and marketing for the Academy and the Oscars for about 6 years full time, then went out on my own, took them as a client. So all told, I basically ran digital media for the Oscar, I think 9 or 10 Oscars shows over the years. And that was, again, starting in 2011, going to about 2020-ish. I think the last one I did was the last show before COVID. So 2019 probably was the last one. And the social media and content landscape, obviously between 2011 and 2019, exploded and was insane. So literally that job went from at the beginning, again, trying to convince people that social media mattered and covering the Oscars with like me and one other person walking around with phones, tweeting stuff. And by the end, massive team. It's all everyone cares about, dealing with brands, dealing directly with the social platforms, just a complete, negotiating big partnerships with companies and social platforms, like completely different job, but super interesting. And then going out on my own and building this consulting company and newsletter and all of that. So a little bit of a long-winded story, but like I said, all these sort of different pieces, but in retrospect, there really is this clear through line that it's always been sort of content strategy, internet. How do various people, all the way from an open mic comedian to the biggest entertainment show in the world, how do you use these tools to accomplish your goals? And that's really what I help people do.
Mm-hmm. So as someone who was on the front lines of the early internet, where do you think things are at now? And when you look at things like Web3 and AI, and I don't fully understand all this stuff. I understand it a little bit. I'm trying to learn more every day. But, as someone who was on the front lines during that moment compared to now, like, where do you think things are going? Is it different? Has it changed? Is there a rebirth or what's going on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a million different angles sort of into that. I think, like most things, everything's changing and everything also stays the same, right? Both things can be true. Everything's always getting better in some ways and getting worse in others, right? I don't think there's a concrete like, oh, everything's getting better, or oh, this is, everything, all the old rules don't exist anymore, and like all of that stuff. So I think there's a lot of nuance in there. I will say, I come from a place of the foundational elements to a lot of this stuff is true. And one of the things that I think differentiates me, a lot of people that are in the sort of social media content space younger than me, right? Like it tends to sort of do young, but I had like a 20 plus, I had about a 20-year career before social media not 20 year, but I was a decade into my career before social media even existed. Right. So I have a foundational sort of understanding and approach to how you market things and how you use content that did not just appear with TikTok. Right. So I think it gives me a sort of different perspective on it. I will say I'm not the Web3, NFT, crypto world, all of that. That is not me. And what's really interesting is I remember in the early days of social media, looking around and immediately not only feeling excited, but feeling like this is going to change everything. I think that's why I started working in it. And I could just see like this changes the complete media landscape. Anyone can build anything. This removes the gatekeepers. So much is possible now that wasn't possible before. And I had that energy and hype and enthusiasm that you saw people up until, a couple of years ago talk about Web3 and like, oh, this is going to change everything. Right. And you see it now, you feel it around AI, and I'll get to that in a second. But what was interesting is when the Web3 stuff was happening, and I saw these other people reacting to it, like this changes everything and this whatever. And I didn't feel that at all. Like I looked into it and I was like, and I genuinely wondered, I was like, have I just gotten older? Like, am I missing something? Because I felt it with social media. I was one of those people that was like, you don't even understand. Like, this changes everything, right? And I didn't feel it with Web3. And so now the fact that Web3 is kind of however you want to define Web3, but like all of that stuff, some of the buzz and the excitement about that has certainly petered out significantly. So now I feel like, oh, maybe that's why I didn't feel excited about it, is because that's not really going to change everything, right? There's some elements of it that might be interesting, but this idea that it changes everything, that's not happening. Now, you're seeing a lot of that around AI. I'm less skeptical of that. I do believe there are some AI is going to impact and change things, but I am also not on the side of like, okay, AI ruins everything. No, not ruins everything, but like, this is a completely different world and there's no more content creation and every AI is going to do everything and you have to use AI and all of that stuff. Like I've dabbled and played with AI. To be honest, I don't use it much. I have yet to find something where it like drastically impacts my workflow or how I do things. And up to this point, as a sort of content creator and writer and creative person and that kind of thing, what I found it best at is really just like a brainstorming tool. My favorite use of it, for example, is I'm not using it to ask it questions and I would never in a million years have it be writing blog posts for me or social posts or any of that. What I will do is, let's say I'm giving a presentation on how to grow a newsletter. I might use the AI to pull stuff out of me. So I would say, say to the AI, like, pretend you're a journalist interviewing me about how to grow newsletters, ask me questions, and every time I give an answer, do a follow-up question. That I think is really interesting. And that I have found helpful, again, as a brainstorming tool to pull stuff out of myself, as opposed to going to it and asking it to sort of do the work for me. Now, that said, just because I'm not using it a lot, I do think, AI is not going anywhere. Like it is going to change stuff. Right. And I do think it's going to make things a lot easier, and it's going to get embedded into lots of tools that we use and to create images and all sorts of stuff. Right. But I think a lot of the fears that people have around it, I think are, it's going to replace artists. And yes, it's going to replace some things. Right. But I also think it's going to make the sort of human elements of creation and art even more valuable. And I think it's going to enable, again, this is not an exact analogy at all, but if you look at things like Spotify and streaming, like what has happened to the music industry? Well, what's happened is more people than ever before can make a living off their music. Fewer people can be huge stars. It's harder to make them, is it harder to make millions of dollars a year off music than it used to be? Yeah, it's probably harder. Certainly harder to make hundreds of millions of dollars than it used to be. But is it harder to make $50,000 a year off your music? No, it's easier, right? More people can have more. So my guess is that some of the AI stuff is going to do that. It's going to enable sort of more people to create and do more things and do them quicker and all that kind of stuff and at a lower cost. But it's not going to wipe out people, at least in my opinion. I have zero fears about AI taking my job. For example, like, even though I work for myself, like I don't worry that I'm going to lose clients to AI.
Well, what kind of impact do you think it's going to have on the film industry, especially when you factor in everything Los Angeles has been going through as of recent, which, I've been feeling, man. I've been feeling it for the past year, like so many others.
Yeah. It's tough to say. Again, I think it's certainly going to impact things. And I think it's going to wind up, like with all technology, it's going to wind up being a mixed bag, right? There's going to be good and bad, right? What impact has social media had on culture and arts and movies and whatever, right? There's a lot of good things it's enabled. There's a lot of bad things that it's enabled. Like there's people that use it for good and people that use it for evil, right? I don't view it as an existential threat. I don't think, I think the movies have plenty of problems that have nothing to do with AI, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. There's fundamental business industry problems, which happens all the time, right? In every industry, like things change and, the economics of it all changes. And so I think it's easy to sort of scapegoat AI and be afraid of AI or, all of that stuff. But I think ultimately, there's always going to be sort of good and bad that comes with all of this. Again, I'm not a filmmaker, but I have to imagine that AI is going to allow a lot more people to make a lot more films and do a lot more things than they otherwise would not have been able to afford to do. So that will create opportunities for some people to break through, and it probably couldn't break through before, or couldn't get someone to cut them a check big enough to make the kind of movie that they wanted to make. And now with AI tools, maybe they'll be able to. Just like, by the way, just like all filmmaking, people are able to make films now that they never would have been able to make 30 years ago just because if you had to, you can make it with a phone. So there is a good and bad.
Do you think LA is going to remain a juggernaut in the entertainment industry, or do you think it's kind of just another participant?
I think that whereas I think there was a time that here's a good example, right? So when I came out of college and decided, okay, I want to do something in the entertainment industry, and I was in Maryland outside DC. If I was going to pursue a career in entertainment, whatever that meant, even if it was as a journalist or whatever that meant, I knew it meant I either have to move to LA or New York, period, basically. I don't know now, and certainly moving forward, that if you wanted to work in quote unquote entertainment, I would feel the same way of like, well, I have to go to one of these two cities. I think you can, depending what you want to do, there's more variety, right? So from that perspective, I don't think you necessarily, LA is maybe not as necessary as it once was. The flip side is LA is still, and I think will be for a very long time, the mecca, the hub of all of this stuff. And it attracts people, even though movies and stuff are shot all over the place. And a lot of them, I don't know the exact stats, but there's probably more shot outside of LA and nowadays than is shot in LA. But it is attracting a certain kind of person, a certain kind of dream, kind of person that chases their dreams, that wants to be in this sort of creative community. And I don't think that's going to go away because people are drawn as much to the people out here, to that community, as they are the actual quote unquote work. Right. And I think that I don't see that changing, right? It's still an entertainment industry town, and even beyond the industry, like it's still a creatively driven city. And I think as long as that is true, it's going to attract more of those people. And to be honest, that's part of why I came to LA instead of New York. I mean, I didn't love New York and I hadn't really ever been to LA. So I was curious, and obviously the weather and all that. But also, as someone interested in creative work, New York has that, but New York's a finance town or a business town, or LA is a creative city, period. Like it is the most prominent industry there. And therefore, I think that sort of filters throughout. There's an energy that filters throughout the whole city. And New York has its own energy, but I think it's different. I don't think the New York energy isn't necessarily, even though there's lots of creative people there, it's different. And so, that's the part that I don't see changing anytime soon.
I hope you're right and I'm wrong.
Oh, you think LA is doomed?
No, doomed is a bit. I think that it is becoming very decentralized. And when you look at some of the choices that have been made in recent years by, the big studio execs, and then you factor in the pandemic and you factor in some of the new stuff now that might mess up how all of the stagehands get paid and things like that. I think it's just a recipe for, people are going to Atlanta, people are going up to Canada, people are going to Europe. I don't want to say that it's 1978 and I'm in the music scene in Detroit. I don't think it's quite that, but I think it is closer to that than it ever has been in 100 years, probably.
Well, I think
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. But what's interesting about this is I also think there's an underlying question in this, which is, how do we define entertainment? Because if we're talking about, so for example, right, why do so many, and I'm a social media guy, but I'm a sort of a social media business guy. I'm not a social media influencer or whatever. But why are so many of those people that have nothing to do with the studios, nothing to do with traditional entertainment, right? TV, like they're living on their YouTube stars, their TikTok stars, that's their thing. But a lot of them are coming out here or are based out here and whatever. So I think there's an interesting piece of this, which is entertainment versus sort of studio, is the studio system in trouble? Absolutely. Like the future, it doesn't mean it's going away, but it's going to have to be like the future that is not on a great trajectory. But entertainment, broadly speaking, like I still think like, and I don't know, but like it is an interesting question to sort of think about and go, why does a YouTuber that's not looking to be in movies and TV or whatever, why are they coming to LA? Mm-hmm. Right? Why is VidCon in LA or Orange County, Anaheim, whatever it is, right? Yeah. And yes, there's, again, some of them do want to be in movies and TV shows and whatever, and agencies and all of that stuff. But I think while the business of the studios is in trouble and that will have a ripple effect in all sorts of different ways, I still think it's just such a town that is so synonymous with entertainment, broadly speaking, that I think it, at least for now, attracts those kind of people. And I think it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? As long as those people are here, it's going to attract more of those people. Right. If they all start to flee, right, then yeah, it changes. But I don't see that happening quickly.
No, that's fair. I mean, I do think some of that fleeing has started to occur some, and yeah, but I'm all.
It definitely has. I'm not saying it's trending upward. I don't think we're falling off a cliff. I think there's there's a dip. But yeah, no. And again, that goes back to what I was saying before is like, the technology has enabled that, right? The truth is you don't need to be here to do that. And that's like I said, if I was coming out of college today and was like, oh, I want to work in entertainment, I think I'd still probably come out to LA, but I don't think I would feel like, oh, I only have two options.
What do you think some of your other options would be if you were graduating today?
In terms of where I would go?
Yeah, where you would go, like what would be available to you to try to get started?
I think the first one option would be, depending where I was coming from, like the first option would be I wouldn't even have to leave to get started, potentially. Mm-hmm. Right? Because depending what I'm creating, like if I was creating, the ability to now reach the entire world from anywhere, and the ability to sort of make whatever you want to call it, content, films, music, whatever, from anywhere, means that if you happen to like where you are, like, okay, you stay there. Maybe you stay there for the first few years until you decide to get, if I wanted to work in the entertainment industry, there was no way I could stay in Washington, D.C. or suburban Maryland and start my career there. Like, what was I going to do? Right. There were no entertainment jobs there. Now I think, and again, now I think it's different. So the first is you wouldn't have to go anywhere. If I was going to go somewhere, I would be looking, to the extent I could, I'd be looking at like, okay, what's my ultimate goal and where does it make sense for me to sort of go to be around that? Ironically, when I first came out here, like I really thought I wanted to work in the music industry, and I just happened to get a job at a, TV PR agency first, which ultimately wound up being a great thing because then Napster happened and the music industry completely collapsed. Right. So, but I would be looking at, if I wasn't going to go to like an LA or New York, I would be looking at sort of like scenes or communities of people. Right. So whatever it was that I wanted to do, like Austin has now become a hub for like the sort of creator, solopreneur, entrepreneur type. Right. If that was the thing I wanted to do, I would have to at least look at it, because it's like, oh, look at all these people, the benefit of, that community there, and then being able to get to know each other and collaborate and whatever. It's not a coincidence. And this is, I think it's Austin Kleon. Have you heard the term like scenius? Like no. Genius, but for a scene. There's I think it was him, and I don't know if he coined it or talked about it from somewhere else, but it's basically this idea that throughout history in the arts, and probably in business, but especially in the arts, that it's not a coincidence that you have lots of sort of successful artists pop from a scene, right? Like, so an obvious one is like grunge in Seattle. If you look at music, right? Like all of a sudden, like every music artist is from Seattle, right? And it disappeared and whatever. And then if you go, and I'm not a literary guy, but if you go back to like famous, like literary salons in Paris or what, like throughout history, you can find these sort of scenes where if you are in that scene for a variety of reasons, right, you get more, there's with grunge, right? All of a sudden everyone's coming in looking for the next Pearl Jam and Nirvana and there's a lot of reasons why it happens. It happens with art. It happens with a million different things, but it gives you a massive advantage in trying to get forward, both from outside attention, but also from relationships, right? So if I'm around a bunch of other people who are doing similar things, creating similar things, growing their audiences, and now it's really, we get to know each other because we're in the same neighborhood and sometimes literally, right? And so it's easy to appear on each other's videos or shows, or all this can happen virtually, but there is something historically to that sort of scenius concept. So I think I would look for or at that and sort of go like, well, where are the people that, that are a few steps ahead of me in terms of where I want to be? Like, where's that happening? And how can I sort of surround myself with that? In the same way that this is totally different, but in the same way, like when you go to college, you're going to be influenced by wherever you put the people you put yourself around, right? Not that I could have gone to Harvard or would even necessarily want to, but if I go to college at Harvard versus going to college at the University of Maryland, that's going to influence my perspective of everything just because of the people. Forget the actual education, but the people you're around and the sort of norms of that culture. It's one of the things I loved about LA, right? Like when I first came out here, I think it is really, really powerful to be surrounded by a lot of so many of the people that are in LA are people that left someplace else to actually chase their dream as opposed to staying where they were talking about their dream. And that's really, and it doesn't matter if most of them are failing. It doesn't matter what's going on, but you are surrounded by people that are dream chasers, that are trying to make something happen. And that impacts your willingness, your belief. I remember very early on when I was in LA meeting some people that were sort of like on, they were not super successful, right? They were trying to make it, right? But I remember like talking to someone and them saying like, he was producing, he had a day job or whatever, but he's like, oh, I'm a producer, I'm producing movies. And I remember being like, you can just do that? Like it was super eye-opening, regardless of whether or not he was going to be successful or not, right? But it was super eye-opening to realize like, oh, like I could just decide to be a producer. Like I could decide, I used to work with someone who was an assistant at the studio I worked with. And, he was doing that and he was trying to produce stuff. And I was like, really? And I remember he told me one day, like he had optioned this book, or optioned this property. And I was like, you optioned like I was used to reading in the trades about people optioning things. It never occurred to me that like, yeah, you could do that if you found a property and spent a little money. It didn't even have to be a lot of money. And being around that is really eye-opening and changes your perception on what's possible, right? People that are not in that situation would have no idea that like, I was living here and didn't really realize like I could do that if I wanted. Oh, I could control that property and, pitch it and whatever. So yeah, I think that's powerful. So I would look to try to go someplace where I could be around the things that I ultimately wanted to do.
So let's switch gears a little bit and go to connected comedy. So that is how I first heard about you. And connected comedy was like you said earlier, it was a resource about using social media and, basically online tools to further your career as a comedian. When you were running that, I was pretty early on in comedy, and it was infinitely helpful to me. I think it would have been even more helpful to me if I was further along. But, I was pretty new at comedy, but still, your advice changed the trajectory of my career. I've told you the story before. So give me a little bit of the history there. Like what led to the starting of connected comedy And then, like in your own words, in your own history, like what led to it ending?
So I had gone to work for this startup comedy website that literally. So when I left New Line Cinema, I actually had sort of two job offers or opportunities as I was trying to figure out the next step. One was to go to Disney and be a marketing writer, which is basically what I had done at New Line, and write their press releases and press kits and marketing materials and whatever. And the other was to go to this startup comedy website. This was around the time Funny or Die. So it was theoretically a Funny or Die competitor, but not really, because they didn't have Will Ferrell and they didn't have, so like a distant competitor, let's say.
Okay.
It had already been around for a year or so, and they were basically about to run out of money. So on the one hand, I had this opportunity to go to Disney, good paying job, good solid marketing writer job. And on the other hand, I had this startup comedy website where literally the guy was the guy who was like doing the hiring was like, I have to warn you, like, if you come here, like, we only have 3 months of money left. So the owner is a pretty wealthy guy and he can put some of his money into it, but there's no guarantee like this is going to go beyond 3 months. So like, if you take this job, like, do so with your eyes open. And that job also, I think, was barely going to pay me what I had been making before. The other one was going to be almost double what I had been making before. So on paper, like, no brainer. But for me, I was like, I wanted to pursue my interests, right? Mm-hmm. At this point, I had been producing some comedy shows, like live stand-up shows and stuff, and was interested in that. And, internet, YouTube, all this stuff was starting to happen. And I was really passionate about comedy. And I sort of saw it as like, okay, this seems like a much more interesting, much more fun job. And it gives me a chance to sort of pivot my career a little, even if this flames out. So I took the job. They did run out of money in 3 months. The guy did fund it himself and wound up being there for about 2 years or so. And it was just gradually, like, it was going away. Basically, it got to this point where it's like they weren't spending enough money to really grow and work, but he didn't want it to go away. So it was like he was floating enough money to just kind of keep it around. But it didn't really have any chance of success. So ultimately that ended. And then I was out on my own and was like, well, do I want a job or what do I sort of want to do? And I felt like I had learned so much. It was this great, like, sort of sandbox for me to figure out how do you use these new tools to grow things, right? To get traffic, to promote comedy videos, to do all that stuff. And so for a long time, I'm a huge fan of Seth Godin and his books. And what I realized was like, okay, so I think that I know how to do this, right? I think I know how to use these tools, blogs and social media and online content and marketing, all this stuff, to sort of attract an audience and grow a business. So maybe it's time to like put up or shut up, right? Like, instead of looking for another job, maybe I should just take what I know. No one is out there talking. That site, there was nothing for comedians really about how to use social media. So it was a wide open space. And I was like, all right, I'm going to try to do this. And so I literally just started blogging every day and figuring it out as I went, and I'll, get people to hire me and I'll do consulting and, figuring all that out, right? Like, what does a coaching call look like? And what do I charge? And how do I, everything, just sort of figuring it out as I go. And what was interesting was, I think I knew a bunch of comics at that point from having worked in the industry. And I think when I first went out on my own, my assumption was the monetization of this is going to come from people who already know me, right? Because I was like, who's going to hire me? They don't even know who I am. Okay, they read a blog post maybe, but like, they're going to hire me to, consult with them or like, and what happened was the exact opposite. Like, all of a sudden, people that I didn't know who had found the blog, who lived in New York. I think you might have lived in Pittsburgh at the time, right?
I did. Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know how I remember that.
But how do you remember that?
That's a moment of clarity. But like, so all these people, just like you, somehow found it. They found it on Facebook. What I realized, by this quick side note, what I realized in the aftermath, which I didn't realize going into it, was one of the advantages it had was because it was such a specific niche of comedians. And because that community is so connected, as soon as one comedian would find something, they would tell all their friends, they're hanging out in clubs all the time talking and being like, hey, did you see this article that this guy wrote? So there was a lot of built-in, even offline sort of word of mouth because it was appealing to this close-knit community, which I didn't really, in retrospect, seems like, oh, that's very smart strategically, but it was a complete accident. Like I didn't think about it. But as a result, all these people started finding it. And the people that started, buying my stuff, hiring me to consult with them were people that I didn't know in real life that lived all over the country, all over the world, whatever. And what I was finding is I was like, oh, all of these things, like this actually works. And the things I'm telling comedians to do, even though I'm a different business, I'm doing for myself, and I'm figuring out that they work, and I'm figuring out like the importance of an email list and how to run Facebook ads and how like all this stuff that I'm learning. So I'm learning it as I'm building this business and then teaching what I'm learning to them with a slightly different angle. The other thing that, again, I didn't really think about going into it, but I think worked in my favor was, so not only was there not really any sort of sources of this information, right? There wasn't much out there for comedians about how to market themselves, and certainly not how to use social media. And whatever there was from other comedians. So the fact that I wasn't a comedian, that my background was actually in marketing, that I had produced some comedy shows, so I knew enough about the industry. I got it, but I wasn't a comedian, gave me a totally different sort of perspective. So I was bringing my knowledge as a sort of marketer and business knowledge, and having worked at studios and internet startup companies and all that stuff, and bringing it to a market where there was nobody that had that expertise or that perspective. And so I think that also helped make it stand out and sort of separated it from a lot of what marketing advice and stuff that was out there, which was just kind of comics talking to other comics. And not that that's not valid, but it certainly differentiated me from the rest, right? And probably gave it more credibility because people would look at it and be like, oh, this isn't some guy that was at an open mic yesterday. Like, this is a guy who was doing marketing for a movie studio, and now for reasons that I can't wrap my head around, he's telling comedians what to do on Facebook. But yeah,
I will say I was part of conversations where people, in a good way, were wondering, why the hell is this guy doing this?
Yeah. Yeah. And
I was just funny. Like, I think he just likes comedy.
Yeah.
I'm glad he's doing it.
Yeah, that's so funny. You know what's interesting is, like, I think, I really liked comedy, and I was really passionate about the internet and social media and what this is the irony, right? Like, there's definitely like a loop there during that time in my life that's going on, right? Because comedians are very much sort of solopreneur, make your own way, figure it out. And especially in that time in comedy, you're starting to see the first time where you really don't necessarily need the gatekeepers and the permission. Like, that's starting to change because of social media and MySpace, like very early on, but it's starting to change. So I think besides always loving comedy and all of that, I think I resonated with that because it's kind of what I was trying to do, right? I was kind of trying to go, I don't need someone to give me a job. I can take my expertise, go direct to people, build an audience, and have them. And this was the theory, I guess, that I was trying to prove to myself, and was sort of ironically proving it as I was teaching it. So there were a lot of, even though I wasn't a comedian, there were a lot of similarities in like what I wanted to do and sort of how I wanted to approach my career with how I thought comedians could approach theirs. The irony is, and this is years later, and now, I don't do a whole lot with comedians anymore, but again, I think a lot of the foundational stuff is still very similar. One of the things that I've realized now is I do more podcasts and I talk about stuff. I have realized that just like a comedian, I have developed bits, because as you can imagine, I get asked the same questions a lot of time. Not so much on this, because we're having a different conversation, but I get on podcasts all the time, and they're like, tell me how to grow your newsletter, blah, blah, blah. And I've realized, just like a comedian would on stage over time, I have honed bits subconsciously that I've refined over time by saying them either on podcasts or to consulting clients or whatever. And now I know they work. So what's hilarious is I will go on podcasts sometimes and they'll ask me questions and I'll say stuff and they'll get reactions like, I can't believe this guy just came up with this off the top of his head. And I'm like, no, I've been doing this forever. And it's very similar, I think, to people that don't know comedy, see a comedian on stage and they think that guy's just like making it up as he goes.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, he's told this joke and refined this bit thousands of times. And that's why he knows it. As again, I'm not going to tell you about comedy, but like every inflection is deliberate and the word choice and and he's seen how people react to it. So it's been interesting that like, even now I still can sort of see similarities to, even though what I do has nothing to do with comedy, there's similarities to sort of that approach.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the key to longevity for any entrepreneur, whether it's a creative, comedian, whatever?
Well, for starters, I think you have to be pursuing things that you want to do. I don't think you're going I know I wouldn't be able to, like, if you're not genuinely excited about it, you're not going to be able to just stick with it for the long haul. Right. And I say that, no, you have to want to do the work more so than just love the results from the work. Right. So I think that at the end of the day, if you're like, oh, I just want to, and maybe some people are wired like this. I'm not, I don't think most people are. The idea that like, you're going to do a thing that you're not interested in doing just because it pays a lot of money. Maybe you can do that for a while, but I think at some point you're going to be like, I'm miserable. Right. It can't just be about sort of the end result. The other thing I think about is, which is sort of related to this, is, I strongly believe you can only be great at something that you really want to do. You can be good at lots of other things. And I think that good is a trap, especially for people that are smart and talented and whatever, right? That they see a million opportunities. I could do this. I could do that. I could take this job. I have this skill and that skill and whatever. And they might even sort of like it. But the truth is, you're never going to be great at something that you're not really excited to do, right? Just because and this is one of I think the biggest traps and one of the most important things to try to be honest with yourself and avoid in your own life is you see an opportunity, you're like, I could do that and I could succeed at that. But are you really excited to do it? Because if you're not, you do that and then suddenly the time and effort and everything you invest in that is taking away from the thing that you would really want to do, right? That you could be an A+ at as opposed to being a B+ at. And so I think that's a piece of it. And then the other thing I think for longevity is, you have to be willing to change and evolve, because I talk about this a lot of times when people ask me about like their niche, right? And they get very paralyzed a lot of times because they're like, well, I want this to be my niche, but I also want to serve these other people, or I also want to do this other stuff. And I'm not sure that I want to only do this. And, I don't know that like, yeah, I want to do this now, but do I really want to do this for the rest of my life or for 5 years or 10 years or whatever? And, what I say is like, your niche is always going to evolve no matter how successful, because everything's changing all the time. The world, whatever. Right. So when you go into things, and I think this ties into longevity, right? Understanding that whatever it is that you're choosing to do is going to change, and the way you do it and the approach you take to it and who you do it for and who you do it with, all that stuff is going to evolve. And the way you actually are able to stick with something for a really long period of time is being willing to evolve as it goes and not be stuck. My newsletter, and people can see it, right? You can go to fortheinterested.com/newsletter1, the number 1, and see the first issue that I wrote, which was like 8 years ago. I've published it every week. And now for the past couple of years, I do weekday versions too, but every Sunday for, 415 weeks in a row. My newsletter is very different now than it was that first issue. Some of the core fundamental things are the same, but it has evolved. If I was not willing to evolve, if I was like, no, this is what the newsletter is, somewhere along the line, I probably would have been like, I don't want to do that anymore. Right. And I think that unwillingness to let yourself evolve or let things change, or, maybe you have whatever it is, you're doing something that's working really well, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work well anymore. You have to be willing to change in order to sort of stick with it for a long period of time. And I think also knowing that going into it frees people up to embrace things and embrace niches, because they don't feel trapped, right? They don't feel like, I don't want to commit to this thing because I'm not sure I want to do it for the rest of my life. Well, once you let people know, like, no one's expecting you to do it for the rest of your life. What I'm saying is, like, for the next 6 months, do this and then see where it goes. But yeah, so I think that those things really, I think, are almost prerequisites to doing anything for a long period of time.
Where can people go to learn more about you?
My newsletter is fortheinterested.com/subscribe. My website is joshspector.com. And I realized in the beginning, I didn't even mention me, great marketer. I didn't even mention I have a podcast, which you probably might want to mention to people who listen to podcasts. My podcast is called I Want to Know. You can check it out on all the various platforms, or you can just go to joshspector.com/podcast and see it there.
And if you're not sure where to start, you can start with my episode.
Yeah, exactly. Put a link in the show notes.
I will. Josh, thanks so much for doing this, man. Always good to connect.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I always like having the chance to talk about comedy and other stuff that I don't talk about probably often enough. So it was fun.
That was Josh Spector. Be sure to check out his podcast, I Want to Know. And if you're not sure which episode to start with my episode. I was actually a guest on Josh's podcast, and we talk about evolving creative projects. So I took his advice, clearly. So check that out. Music for the 1000 podcast is provided by Andrew Saxonov. Be sure to check out his podcast, They Watching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can do so over patreon.com/ronplacone. For a Give What You Can level, you get all kinds of bonus content, free stand-up clips not available anywhere else, full stand-up clips not available anywhere else. I do screenings and other insider information sessions on upcoming projects and films, and I'm starting up more Zoom shows. So I'm going to be doing Zoom shows for patrons. It's a really cool community, and you can give for a Give What You Can level. Even $1 a month goes a long way. All right, it's officially a year. Episode 52 in the bag. We've been around for a year, and here's to many years to come. However many years it takes to get to 1,000, which is approximately 20. I think it's like 19 point something. I did the math when I started this thing. So we still got a while to go. But unlike a lot of podcasts, this podcast has a definitive end date. Episode 1,000, technically 1,001 because the trailer, but that is where we will end. Kind of makes you in touch with the finiteness of it all. Is that a word? I don't think it is, but that's okay. You get it. See you next week. Peace. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1,000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1,000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1,000 is doing for me, and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1,000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1,000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.